Today we are going to look at the theme of responding to opposition, and we will start our passage from where we stopped yesterday, which is Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 19. Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing you are doing? You are rebelling against the king." Then I replied to them, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." And then we go on to chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 4 and verse 1. Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burnt ones at that?" And Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, they are building. What they are building, if a fox goes up on it, it will break down their stone wall." Words of humiliation against Nehemiah and his colleagues. The three opponents are mentioned in verse 19. Sanballat, who was a top official and may have once had jurisdiction over Judah, and now probably was the governor of Samaria in the north. Tobiah the Ammonite was the official in the east. Ammon, of course, is in the east of Jerusalem, and he has a Jewish name. Then the next one is an Arab called Geshem, probably to the south and the east. So they are surrounded by enemies. Let me just say that anyone who's doing anything significant is going to be opposed. Often they are jeered and despised. That's what is said here. When Sanballat and these three people, when they heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us. Great people are usually admired from a distance. When they were doing their heroic work, they were going against the tide, people jeered at them. They seemed to be so foolish. They looked like fools. And then, of course, they did their great work and became famous. And the same people who jeered at them say, "Oh, I studied with him in school." Here, Nehemiah is rising up for a despised people. And similarly, anyone who speaks up for the rights of the weak is going to be attacked by the strong. And shame is one of the hardest things to take. William Booth was a hero in the way he ministered amongst the poor in England, in Britain. And another hero who was a contemporary of William Booth was the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a brilliant politician and was responsible for enacting a lot of legislation to protect the poor, the insane, and people like that. And he was also a strong evangelical. So he's a hero in the Christian church. One day he got up at a meeting and he said that he had studied the Salvation Army, of which William Booth was the founder, and he's convinced that it is the Antichrist. Someone in the audience added to that and said, he studied the name William Booth. And he said, the numbers of that name come up to 666. William Booth and his associates were bitterly attacked in the press. One day his son Bramwell showed the father something that was in the newspapers about him. And the father told the son, "Bramwell, 50 years hence, it will matter very little indeed how these people treated us. It will matter a great deal how we dealt with the work of God." We can expect criticism, laughter. We will be upset and hurt because that's natural and we are humans, but we won't get disillusioned and give up. And then verse 19 and the second part, it says, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Now, this is a standard accusation of people who are challenging the status quo. They are a threat to the state or to the rebels, or they are rebels, or they are insubordinate, people would say in an office, or they're working for the CIA, is a common accusation. When you speak up for the rights of a race during a time of ethnic conflict, which is what happened in our country, immediately you're branded a terrorist. And even though you might fully oppose terrorism, William Wilberforce was accused of advocating the economic suicide of the British Empire. The same was told about Abraham Lincoln and the United States of America. Nehemiah was faithful to the king and a trusted worker, but he's accused now of rebellion. But verse 20 tells us his response. Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and his servants will rise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. He refuses to be intimidated. He didn't speak about the authority given by the king because they already knew that. He wanted to establish right at the start that they were taking on God. And indeed, there is wisdom when we bring up this. We had a situation in our office once when there were people from the north, from the race that was rebelling against the government, and the police used to often come and visit our office and question the people who were there. And they questioned a young boy, about 20 years old, and they were very rude to him, very humiliating. And this boy, Christian, wanted to love his enemy. He told this man who was questioning him, I will pray for you. And that guy got so angry because he thought this guy is going to pray a curse upon him. And he scolded him even more. I was, of course, dumb. I couldn't say anything. I was so upset. And I later protested about it to the police. And I heard that they were given a bit of a scolding for what they did. But we must be sure that God has approved our projects. But if He has approved our project, when opposition comes, we can say God is with us. Martin Luther, when the movement was growing, an envoy came from the Pope and said, if you continue with this, you will be outlawed. And when your work is illegal, you will have great trouble. Your people will be scattered. And he said, where will you be then? And Luther replied, then as now, in the hands of God. We have God with us, and we can go on. And then the last part of verse 20, he says, you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. When people come with strong accusations, we have to show if they have no jurisdiction to do so, that there is a legal ground to stand on. And for us in Sri Lanka, it's very important. We are being attacked. The church is being attacked. The church is growing, and it's being attacked. And we work a lot on the legal ground that we have to share the gospel. We trust in God, and we appeal to the law. Paul did this often, and as you see in the book of Acts. And of course, you see the wisdom of Nehemiah getting the letters earlier on because he wanted legal backing in case something like this came up. We are always loving and kind. We are always respectful of everybody. We never take revenge, but we will insist on protection under the law. Paul's behavior in Philippi shows this. He was unjustly assaulted and put into prison. And in prison, he's praising God. The jailer is impressed. And then when there is an earthquake, he refuses to escape and keeps the others with him. The jailer is even more impressed. And then he believes in Christ. And then, of course, he's let out. And I thought that this is a bad climax to a lovely story of a gracious person. Because when he's let out, he refuses to go. He says, I'm a Roman citizen. You have no right to do this to me. And I was surprised, but as I studied this, I realized he was trying to establish the legal protection for the cause of Christ. And that's very important. And therefore, the people have to come and let him out and say, sort of they are embarrassed, but he has won a legal battle here. Jesus asked us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So we need to be aware of the law and ask how we can use it to protect the cause of Christ. How can we work within the law? The call of God often brings problems with us, but we have this dual response. On the one hand, we trust in God. On the other, we look with wisdom at the ways of the world. Now, the next passage is chapter 3. And if I was in Sri Lanka, I would spend a whole study on chapter 3, because it's talking about administration. And we are very weak in that, and how they administered this whole process. It's a very exciting passage, but for me, as an Asian from Sri Lanka, to speak about administration to the Europeans, I think is not very appropriate. So, I will get on to chapter 4. We come to verse 1 of chapter 4. Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged and jeered at the Jews. Again, the jeering is taking place. Then look at how he does this, verses 2 and 3. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burnt ones at that? And Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. The focus was on the powerlessness and the inability of these people. What can these weak people do? They are untrained. They don't know anything about war. Very often people don't see God's power when they look at us. They see weak-looking people. Goliath did this with David when he said in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 43, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? In Sri Lanka, many people feel this way. When their churches are visited, when their churches are attacked, they feel so strong. It's true, we are weak, but God is strong. And so Hudson Taylor says, all God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on God being with them. We are weak, but God is strong. And the giants of the faith were ordinary people who trusted in an extraordinary God. Well, verses 4 and 5, we find him praying for justice. So it's another of these flash prayers of Nehemiah about which we talked yesterday. Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their heads and give them up to be plundered in the land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt. Let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. So when we are attacked, our first reaction is prayer. When the church was told not to preach in the name of Christ for the first time, they come and tell their companions, and they, with one mind, they join together and they pray in Acts chapter 4. So often when good people are attacked, as we said yesterday, they can have a bad response, which unnecessarily aggravates the problem, and they lose their credibility. Some give up when they are attacked, immediately send a letter of resignation, which they regret having sent, or especially if it's accepted. And sometimes they are too hostile, and they get too violent in their response. So it's important for us when we are attacked to go to God and get our orientation right. Before I started my job in 1976, I spent several months while I was a student in America studying the book of Acts. I was going to lead an evangelistic movement, and I thought, let's fashion our movement from the book of Acts. So I studied it very carefully, and I thought, I will teach it to our staff, and we will try and put it into practice, which is what we did. And then I thought, after 15 years of doing this, I want to write a book on Acts. When the 15 years was over, subsequently, my wife and I helped start a church, and that also we tried to apply the book of Acts as we started the church also. And but when 15 years had gone, I realized, who's going to give a Youth for Christ worker an opportunity to write a book on Acts, and exposition is not interested and all of that. And then out of the blue, I got this invitation about 20 years after I had started my job from Zondervan publishers to write the book on Acts in the NIV application commentary. And I was thrilled. I got permission from our board to do this. And after some time, they asked me to send a sample of what I had done. Now, I was the only one in the New Testament series who was not a professor or a full-time teacher in a seminary. And I was told, is the only one without a PhD. And I was very nervous when I sent my first sample. And I made a very foolish mistake. I sent it on the Cornelius passage, and presented a view of Cornelius and salvation outside here in the gospel that was not very popular with some of those who read it. And back came the responses from the various people who read it. And one of them said, the senior editor of HarperCollins, which owns Zondervan, had said that this will be a series that any seminary professor could freely recommend to his students. And then he said, with this commentary, we may lose that recommendation. When I read this, I was devastated. I told my wife, I live near the sea. So I told my wife, and I went to the sea, to the beach, and I walked with God, struggling, and came back saying, I'll show these people that we can produce something that will be helpful to the church. The book was published in 1998, and it still continues to sell. I think it's done well, so I think God blessed that project. But note their prayer, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt. Let not the sin be blotted out of their sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. The focus of the prayer is on the shame they face, and the affront to God's glory, and the need to expose wickedness, and the need for such wickedness to be judged. When evil thrives, God is dishonored, and people are even misled to do wrong, and the righteous suffer. There's a great disincentive to righteousness when evil thrives. Something within us rises up and says, that should be judged. And that's a biblical idea. The Bible is very clear that evil will be judged. And a major motivation for obedience to God's way is that it is foolish to disobey, because we will be judged if we disobey. So when evil reigns and the righteous are struggling, we naturally ask the question, where is justice? Shouldn't these people be punished? You see this often in the Old Testament, especially with the Psalms that are called the imprecatory Psalms, that talk about, let these people be cursed. It comes out of a commitment to God's righteousness. When evil reigns, there's a huge damage that is done to the world. Evil must be punished. In fact, this is the reason why we are not bitter. We work hard, but we refuse to bribe, we refuse to tell lies, we refuse to cut others in order to climb. And our progress is held back because of our honesty and our commitment to Christian principles. So we have reason to be angry. Those who are committed to justice are angry about injustice, but we have no reason to be bitter, because we know that these people are going to be punished. We should actually be sad for these people. In fact, we are doing them a favor by exposing their unrighteousness, because if they face up to their sin in this world, they will be prevented, they will be avoid the judgment in the next, which is far more serious. So when we call people to account for the wrong that they have done, we are actually doing them a favor by presenting them an opportunity to get cleared of this wrong before they go to the great judgment. Even when Christ saved the world, love did not overcome justice. Love satisfied justice. A ransom was paid for our forgiveness. A punishment was given, and God's anger was spent, and it was taken on in love by the spotless Son of God. But of course, we are not the ones who do the punishing. If we do that, we will make a mess of it. So the Bible asks us to do what we can, which is to love these people. Romans 12:14 says, bless those who persecute us. 12:17, repay no one evil for evil. Verse 20, if your enemy is hungry or is thirsty, give him to eat or to drink. 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. However, verse 19 of Romans 12 says, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And Romans 13, of course, shows one of the ways in which God repays in society through government authorities who administer God's wrath. And so, evil is going to be judged. If not, it's going to be a mockery of justice and a disincentive to live a righteous life. When evil is encouraged and God is dishonored. But let God and his appointed representatives handle the punishment. When we take this into our hands, we can make a mess of it, ruin our peace, ruin our name and our credibility, and cause a lot of damage. And so we know how churches are brought to the ground by good people who try to show that they are right and the others in the church are wrong, and how churches get ruined by that. So when evil reigns, we pray for justice. And when we realize that God will judge, there is no bitterness. We say it's not fair, and it's right for us to say that. But we also say the last chapter has not been written. Now we come to verse 6, a very exciting verse. It says, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. They are making good progress. The people who were once a demotivated, defeated people have now started working hard, and they have a mind to work. The NIV puts it as the people worked with all their heart. A great leader has roused up a discouraged, lethargic people and motivated them to work hard. You know, this is one of the important contributions of Christianity to the world, and it's seen a lot in Europe. We have a strong work ethic. In the Bible, work is good. And what we do for the glory of God. Everything we do. 1 Corinthians 10:31. This is God's world. And when we work, we are caring for God's world. And He has asked us to do that. So we are God's vice regents, deputies of God, the King. And however, among a depressed people, as we have in our own country, usually there is no such view. Today in Sri Lanka, there is no such view of work. Because leaders have exploited people and they have not thought of their welfare, so they think of work as something that is necessary to get a salary. There is a class difference. So when in Sri Lanka, when we talk of the working class, it's a derogatory term. And so some people's work is not considered significant. And it's amazing to see in Sri Lanka how people who are struggling financially have an opening to do a job, but they refuse to do it because that job puts them down in society. It's an assault on their identity and their significance. Rules remind them of their weakness because the rich and the powerful don't have rules. They are exempt from the rules, whereas they have to follow the rules. We leaders have a great challenge to redeem the idea of work, that we are working for God, and that there is significance in all that we do. This is expressed well in the booklet by Brother Lawrence, The Practice of the Presence of God. He was a monk, 7th century lay brother, 17th century lay brother. And for several years, he worked in the kitchen with considerable resentment and frustration. And then he had an encounter with God. And he realized that God was present in the kitchen. And whether he's in the kitchen or whether he's a cobbler, which is what he did after that, he said, all work is done for the love of God. And because it's done for the love of God, it's a great work. Howard Hendricks tells the story about how he was on a trip. And the plane was late, and everybody was angry. And they were rude to the flight staff, and the flight staff in return were rude to them. It was a terrible flight. But there was one girl, a stewardess, who was very polite in the midst of all of this. And at the end of the flight, when he was going out of the plane, she was there at the door. And he told her, "Can you please tell me your name? I want to write to American Airlines and tell them what a good job you did on this difficult flight." And she replied, "But I don't work for American Airlines. I work for God." Let's redeem the idea of work. Let's remind people that when we work, we are doing it for God. Then we come to verses 7 to 9. Verses 7 and 8 tell us, but Sanballat and Tobiah, and when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that we were repairing the walls, and Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. Now the Samaritans are on the north, the Ammonites on the east, the Arabians on the south, and Ashdod to the west. So north, south, east, west, there were enemies. And so sometimes we have situations like that, when the outlook is terrible. But as they say, when the outlook is bad, try the uplook. And that's what these people do. So, and they all plotted together, verse 8, to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion in it. But verse 9, and we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. It's a dual strategy. They prayed to their God and they set a guard as a protection against them day and night. There was prayer and there was defense. Serious opposition requires a serious response. God works on earth through our effort. Therefore, work and strategy is not contrary to prayer. Sometimes you hear people saying, you say you pray and then you go and see a doctor. Where is the faith in this? Well, God uses doctors sometimes to provide answers to our problems. Unless, of course, God has supernaturally given us some word to say that He's going to heal us without a doctor's help. We use both methods. They are one in God's sight. So the New American Commentary, which is a very good commentary on Nehemiah, it says, prayer and precaution, trust and good management. Both were involved. And then, however, a problem has arisen. The people are afraid. Verses 10 and 11, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So, what was happening is that there has been some negative feedback for two reasons. Firstly, verse 10 says, they are tired. Verse 10 says, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall. It's said in poetic form, so it could have been a lament that they sang, like the spirituals in the Afro-American tradition. And how many great leaders have struggled with this when they were doing a significant work? There is nothing in the Bible to say that faithful Christians must be tired. Nothing in the Bible to say that. But sometimes, when Christians face difficult situations, the challenges are so tough that they are forced to go beyond the normal work of comfortable schedule to work hard and be tired. And that's what happened too. One of the best books I have read on the Christian life of a male leader is the book called The Disciplines of a Godly Man by Kent Hughes. There is his book, Disciplines of a Godly Family here, which is also a very good book. But his book, Disciplines of a Godly Man, is very good. And what he says here is true for women too. He says, it has been said that the world is run by tired men. And it is true. For we see that daily America is run by tired politicians. And that wars are won by exhausted generals. And that peace is secured by tired diplomats. And that great legislation is accomplished by weary legislators. And the reason for this is that such leaders are willing to put themselves out whenever necessary in order to accomplish noteworthy tasks. Hughes continues, likewise, the Christian world is ministered to by tired people. Show me a great church, and I'll show you some tired people, both up front and behind the scenes, because greatness depends on a core of people who are willing to put out as the situation demands. Men, and it's true of women too, we have to understand that we will never do great things for God without the willingness to extend ourselves for the sake of the gospel, and even when we are bone tired. And this is true in our churches too, in our ministries. When there is a crisis, leaders have to respond. When I was coming here, we had a crisis in our ministry. One of our leaders had fallen into sin. And we had to deal with, when discipline comes, you have to deal at once. So on the way to the airport, I had to stop on the way, and we had a meeting and tried to work out a way of responding to this, even though it was not an opportune time. Very often, when there is a unity problem, for example, Ephesians 4:3 says, do your best or earnestly seek. The word has an idea of urgency to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. When there's a person in need, we have to respond immediately, and the result may be tiredness. Of course, we must always have our time with God in prayer and the Word. We must always make sure that we have a Sabbath. And when I have to break rest for a problem like that, I try to compensate later on by taking an afternoon nap or something. But we are servants, and the needs of the people we serve sometimes comes up at the most inconvenient times. It's a tough work. Sometimes we have a sermon to prepare, and there is this huge problem in the church, and we have to go and talk to the leaders and try and bring peace. When we come home, it's late in the night. Tomorrow morning, we have to preach. We can't say, well, I'm sorry, Lord, I don't have the time, you'll have to give me the words. No, we have to stay and prepare because we are representing God before the people. So it can be tiring when we seek to go that second mile as leaders of the kingdom. And then, of course, so that was their first problem, tiredness. And the second problem was opposition. The enemies have planned to attack. And the meaning of verse 12 is not very clear because it says, messages are coming 10 times. Probably what it meant was that messages are coming from all over. Come back to our villages. We are vulnerable. We are going to be attacked. And so defend your hometown, because the people, everyone, all the able people have come to Jerusalem, and they are rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, that the villagers have now become vulnerable. Verses 13 and 14 is very significant. There is an immediate response to their fears. In the Bible, when people complain, there's an immediate response. That is the pattern in the Bible. In Acts chapter 6, there is murmuring among the church that the Grecian widows are not being looked after. That word gongosmos, which is translated murmuring or grumbling, is what they call an onomatopoetic word, where the sound suggests the sense. Gongosmos sounds like the buzzing of the bees. Something unpleasant was happening in the church. And usually when things like this happen, we get very hurt. After all we have done, look at the way they are complaining, and we get hurt and upset. But the early church responded immediately. And the result was a major administrative change in the structure of the church, with deacons being given. Same here. Here, they respond immediately. And there is an emergency response in verse 13. It says that, so in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. So that's an emergency response. Then verse 14, and I looked. The NIV puts this as I looked things over. He wanted to get an understanding of the situation. So he considered the situation carefully. And then he says, and arose and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. And so he gets everybody together now. Nobles, officials, and the rest of the people. So the whole people are going to be exposed to what Nehemiah is going to say. In verse the 14 and the third part, it says, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. It was a powerful speech to motivate the people, to lift up their spirits, and to get them back to work. So there was a practical response of further defense arrangements, and then there is a motivational response of a message from God to the people. In the history of the world, there have been famous speeches that have roused people to action. They were well prepared and passionately communicated. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was one of them. Mahatma Gandhi had a message called the "I have faith in the righteousness of our cause." Winston Churchill, at the start of the Second World War, promised the people blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Martin Luther King had this famous speech of his at the Lincoln Memorial called "I Have a Dream." And of course, sometimes these speeches have been used for evil purposes too, as Hitler did with his passionate speeches. At crisis periods, leaders prayerfully present such rousing calls to commitment to the people. I think I've told you several times that we had a war in Sri Lanka, and it was an ethnic war, and we worked with both races in our ministry. And God had mercifully, for about 25 years, through the war, kept us from any serious ethnic problem within the ministry. Sometimes it would come up, but it was never serious. As the war was coming to an end, and the government was making progress against the Tamil, the minority rebels, and thousands of people were being killed during those last few weeks. And the Sinhalese people, my race, the majority race, they were rejoicing. We are winning. We are winning. But the Tamil people were mourning. Our people are dying. And I was always trying to present what I felt was a just response. And the people of my race on our staff were getting upset with me, because he's saying all your friends are Tamils and you're just presenting the Tamil viewpoint, not our viewpoint. And I realized that for the first time, we are encountering a serious ethnic problem in our ministry. So what we did was, we got all our leaders together. Well, not all, representative leaders from both races. We got them together, and we spent a considerable time talking, asking what is the problem, what are the grievances of the different groups, what does the Bible have to say about this. We spent a fair amount of time, and I just took down notes. And then for 1 month, I thought about it scripturally, and I presented a message to the whole community of Youth for Christ in Sri Lanka. I gave it to our staff, and then I spoke in Sinhalese with a translation into the Tamil language, and sent CDs all over the country to our centers for them to hear. It was a biblical answer to what we are doing. What can we do? Where can we agree? Where can we agree to disagree? And I think God prevented us from a major ethnic crisis in our ministry because of that. So what I'm saying is that when there are problems in our ministries, we look things over, we study the situation, and we come up with a biblical response to that situation. When we see a crisis brewing, seriously listen to what the people are saying. I find that I'm usually very hurt. Why are they saying this? See how much I have sacrificed for this ministry, and look what they're saying now. Usually that's my gut reaction, and there's a temptation. Oh, I know him, he's always complaining. That's him. And to try and downplay the criticism. But we must resist that temptation. And pray, listen, think, consult, and present something from God to the people in response to the crisis. Now we come to verse 15. And verse 15. When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we returned to the wall, each to his work. You notice how he gives God the credit for what has happened. When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan. It was Nehemiah's great, brilliant leadership that had done this, but he knew it was God who was behind it. Christian leaders are aware that all the credit goes to God, not to them. They know how much they fall short, and they work on correcting their shortcomings, but they have no time bothering with praise. If it comes, thank you, Lord. We don't want to hurt people who praise us by saying, give God the glory and, put them down. Thank you, Lord, if that comes. But what is important is that the people realize that God has done everything. We don't deserve anything. William Wilberforce, after maybe 25 years of battling in Parliament, finally won slavery, not only against slavery, abolishing of slavery, not only in England, but in the whole British Empire. When he had finished, this process, when the voting was complete, there were prolonged cheers. And people were standing, cheering William Wilberforce. And he was seated, tears pouring down his eyes. And then there were speeches and, the British ways of saying, I don't know what, hip hip hurrah or something like that. Anyway, they were praising him. And he came back home. And the next day, he spent his time meditating on Psalm 115. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. So we give all the glory to God. So now there is a new normal. Verses 16 to 23. They work and they defend. A carefully planned, comprehensive, and adequate practical steps have been worked out. When threats and challenges come, we can't ignore. That would be foolish. We can't be paralyzed by inaction. That will be disobedience. That's what happened in Sri Lanka. Some churches, when the war came, some churches said, oh, now we can't preach the gospel. Now we have to care for our people. And those churches were dying. Whereas others said, no, now is an opportunity to go and preach the gospel. And during the war, the church in Sri Lanka grew unprecedentedly. Since independence, the church was just going down, 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 down. And then the war came and the church started going up again. Even though many people left the country, the population of Protestant Christians grew. So here they had this response: security and work, defense and construction. Verse 16 talks about a special group of what they call my servants, who were, half of them worked on construction, half held spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And then the second part of verse 16 says, and the leaders stood behind them, behind the whole house of Judah. So the leaders were behind, giving them support. And verses 17 and 18 says, the general workers had an instrument of work in one hand and a weapon in the other. Charles Spurgeon used this verse to name the magazine that he used to produce, called The Sword and the Trowel. Trowel is a mason's tool. So there was one group that had a sword and a mason's tool with them. Defense and progress, always. The church is always missional. We respond to attacks, but we also see how we can make progress for the kingdom. And then verses 19 and 20 tell us that if there's a major problem, there are people with trumpets who are to alert the whole congregation that there is a problem. So that's contingency in case there's a major problem. What we see in this passage is passionate perseverance. Someone who refuses to give up when problem comes. We look to God, we take remedial action, but we keep the vision burning. I want to take a few seconds to talk about William Carey. He made famous the statement, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. But in practice, he was characterized by dogged perseverance. When he went to India, he was refused entry by the East India Company, and so he found a Danish colony that gave him place to work. He had no funds from his mission organization, so he had to work as the manager of an indigo factory in that place. He learned Bengali and Hindi, and he worked for the conversion of Hindus, and the first baptism took 7 years to come, 7 years of labor. And then he translated portions of the Bible, the entire Bible, he and his team, to Bengali and 5 other languages, and portions of the Bible to 29 other languages. He translated famous Indian writings. He was working on a huge dictionary when fairly long into the process, there was a fire and everything was lost. And he had to pick up and start again. Along the way, his wife went insane, and then she died, causing him a lot of embarrassment, a lot of pain. He did other things, started the Horticultural Society of India, had a huge impact in outlawing sati, which is the practice of killing the wife along with the dead husband. Now, William Carey called himself a plodder. A plodder is one who works laboriously and monotonously on a given task. That's how the dictionary puts it. He wrote about anyone who wants to write his biography. He gave one guideline. He said, if he give me credit for being a plodder, he will describe me justly. Anything beyond that will be too much. I can plod. I can persevere in any definite pursuit. To this, I owe everything. Galatians 6:9 says, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up.